Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Ringling Raconteur. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. Although to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure if our friend, Waldo Emerson, wishes the same. We'll explore why in this video as we look at Self-Reliance, the second of Emerson's essays first series. I mentioned that I'll be putting up a video on the 10th of each month discussing the essays this year. And we're into one of the more famous ones, although one that I'm not always sure everybody's read. Self-Reliance is one of those virtues, signifiers of identity within the United States. And usually it's meant to refer to economic self-reliance. I think it'll be interesting to question if that's what Emerson means by it and whether or not it's even a good thing. Certainly the events of the past year have allowed us to interrogate the idea of self-reliance in a different way than we perhaps had in certainly a couple of generations. So let's get on with it. Published, of course, in the 1840s, along with the other essays first series. And let's jump right in. Emerson mentions, the highest merit we ascribe to Moses, Plato, and Milton is that they set at naught book and traditions and spoke not what men, but what they thought. And of course, this idea right away that independence, the individual voice is very important, and that needs to be valued. And he goes on to say, trust thyself. More commonly, we think of that as know thyself from the motto at Apollo's temple at the Oracle at Delphi. And it was, of course, quoted by Plato. It was mentioned by Socrates. And Emerson mentions it sometimes. In this case, he switches it from know thyself to trust thyself, though, which is a different verb. And I think it's important that it's a different verb. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. That feels like a paragraph Teddy Roosevelt read when composing some of his speeches, if I'm perfectly honest. And so that right away, that's sort of what we have, this idea of self-reliance and the value of the individual voice. Certainly an ethos that continues to permeate culture and identity within the United States. But let's move on to the dangerous side and see if that these ideas remain influential. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. There's going to be some 1840s gender references in here. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the nature of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Absolve you to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world. When that idea is taken to its extreme conclusion, we enter a very dangerous world. And I think the past year has really illuminated that, like I said, in a way that perhaps had not been clear for a couple of generations. Society everywhere in conspiracy against, the manhood. And being a nonconformist and absolve you to yourself. Well, during a pandemic, people will, talk about how they don't want society's conspiracies forced upon them, and that they perhaps don't need to wear a mask. And they can absolve, the non-mask wearer can absolve one to himself or herself or their self and make this choice and justify it and self-rationalize it. But we know that then creates a danger for others. It is a deadly choice. And I think that's kind of something that needs to be questioned within some of Emerson's ideas. And questioned, in the concept of self-reliance is how it affects others. And Emerson doesn't really get that. He can really lack some empathy. Let's explore how. Your goodness must have some edge to it, else it is none. It feels like we're in the 1990s when they started replacing C's with K's on words to make them sound extreme. The doctrine of hatred must be preached as the counteraction of the doctrine of love when that pules and whines. Emerson was also a sports coach, apparently. He goes on to resent charities, relief societies, alms to the sots. And this is getting at that idea of selfish self-reliance, this idea of economic self-reliance, that nobody helped me and I made my own way, so I don't need to help anybody else. Everybody else needs to find his or her own way. It's just nonsensical. But thankfully, Emerson tells us in this same essay that we get to question these ideas, including the ideas he's presenting, and the dominant traditions he influences. He goes, bring the past for judgment into the thousand-eyed present. And I say we do that with some of these ideas. He goes on to say, and this is really important because Emerson is often presented as a sage or as this almost prophetic speaker. You know, he mentions Moses and Plato and Milton as some of his precursors. But he reinforces this idea that change is not only like okay, but it's good. That when you examine something from the past in the light of the present and find that it doesn't hold up anymore, discard it, move forward. And we need to do that with some of these ideas. We also get the aphoristic Emerson, who sometimes reminds me a little bit of Nietzsche in his aphoristic writings, like Beyond Good and Evil and some of the others, where they give these pronouncements that sound so like witty and pithy and don't always hold up. So let's explore this one. Is the acorn better than the oak, which is its fullness and completion? Whoa. Whence then this worship of the past? That sounds really, really intelligent. But here's the thing. A couple of pages earlier, Emerson was going on and cataloging earlier great men and their movements. So he lists Caesar, Christ, Martin Luther, Copernicus comes in for a name check, and so all of these people, and he talks about their movements and all of these great men. But here's the thing, and he is now sort of saying that are the great men the acorns and the movements the oaks, because that's what he says a couple pages later with this great aphoristic statement. But if within the movement we are each supposed to be independent and trust ourselves and our own ideas and our own drive where Providence has placed us, then we within the movement need to be flourishing and moving forward. It doesn't quite work. So let's get in at the very end. He finally starts to tell us what the heck he's referring to when he talks about self-reliance. And it's maybe not economic self-reliance. Let us not rove. He previously had the quintessential bad U.S. tourist trope where he rails against traveling to other places and rips Italy and England and some other places. Greece. Let us not rove. Let us sit at home with the cause. Bid the invaders take the shoes from off their feet, for God is within. We have that transcendentalism idea. Man does not stand in awe of man, nor is his genius admonished to stay at home, to put itself in communication with the internal ocean, but it goes abroad to beg a cup of water of the urns of other men. That's strong, and that really does get at not only the idea of transcendentalism, but that idea of searching within. He not in this essay, but in an address earlier in his career, he had advanced the idea where he mocks Alexander and Napoleon and some others as pursuing conquest in other lands instead of realizing that the true battle they needed to be fighting was within. And they essentially surrendered that battlefield to go wander and wreak havoc on the world. And so this paragraph reinforces that idea. And then we get to one of the most famous passages, probably the single most famous passage from the essay Self-Reliance. It's the one Harold Bloom always would quote. But I think it needs to be interrogated just a little bit with what is referred to earlier on that page. So first off the passage, as men's prayers are a disease of the will, so are their creeds a disease of the intellect. And it seems like Emerson, who's famously a nonconformist, who does question, the systems of organized religion in many places, is also just ripping prayer here. But here's the thing, earlier on that same page, here's how he refers to prayer. Prayer is the soliloquy of a beholding and jubilant soul. That sounds pretty good. It is the Spirit of God pronouncing his works good. Again, that sounds pretty good. He goes on to talk about how prayer, inaction, is a very powerful thing. It's the acting out of goodness. It is like the action of the jubilant soul then. It is the good works that, God is pronouncing. And those are all really good things. He's not ripping prayer. What he's talking about is specifically, this is what he says, prayer as a means to effect a private end is meanness and theft. Selfish prayer, that's what would seem to align with the economic self-reliance that we ascribe to Emerson, but perhaps don't actually find in him. That's the one that he feels is diseased. We get another fun aphorism. The civilized man has built a coach but has lost the use of his feet. Oh. Let's all start jogging. And then finally, what is this self-reliance we're talking about? Is it economic self-reliance? The reliance on property is the want of self-reliance. Again, we talk about the concept of self-reliance and this key aspect of national identity within the U.S. Emerson is explicitly saying it is not property-based. He goes, people measure their esteem of each other by what each has, not by what each is. And that is such a critical idea. That is one of the really good golden nuggets within this essay. There are other parts that I think should be questioned. The lack of empathy that Emerson has across his essays really, really stinks in my reading, particularly in 2021, in the midst, we are not in the aftermath, but in the midst of a global pandemic that has taken so many lives and had a true toll on people. But this idea that, measurement by who we are, not by what we have, is really where we need to be thinking and where we need to be evaluating. And measuring ourselves by who we are and not by what we have is also really critical. There are many ideas to pull from this essay. Next week will be next month will be compensation, which should be interesting. Is it going to be economic compensation? Let's find out. And I'll put links to this essay in the description box and to next month's essay in the description box. Very briefly, a couple of other, books that I was reminded by as I was reading this essay. One would, of course, be the various Socratic dialogues by Plato. That idea of know thyself is very important, but also the idea of finding what is good, finding virtue, finding what is good, is a key theme in many Platonic dialogues. I have Protagoras here. That's one that seems to push at that idea. There aren't explicit quotes by Marcus Aurelius in Self-Reliance, but the Stoics are mentioned, and it's very obvious that Emerson was dabbling in the meditations. Certainly, if not while writing Self-Reliance, while he was thinking on some of those ideas. And Henry Adams' Education, the Education of Henry Adams, that autobiography, seems to me to sort of be a continuation of some of Emerson's ideas, and to try to put some of those ideas into practice, really about a generation later. And then an interesting one is I've been reading Shadow and Act by Ralph Ellison, who was named for Ralph Waldo Emerson. There's a joke about how Ellison would try to say his name. My name is Ralph Waldo and they would interrupt me. Don't you mean Emerson? He'd say, no, that's the kid next door, because his neighbor as a boy actually was named Emerson. But Ellison advances some of the ideas from Emerson, particularly the idea of, you can't choose your family, but Ellison argues you do pick the ancestors you choose to follow in. And that seems to be sort of an Emerson ideal, this sense of choice involved, this sense of agency, this sense of independence. And Ellison, really talks about trying to find his own voice and advance a voice that he wasn't finding elsewhere in literature, in a way that I think Emerson would have hopefully supported. And well, I don't know that he supported anybody, but would have hopefully viewed as another example of a great man. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you've read this essay. And we look forward to compensation next month. Thanks, everybody.